Welcome everybody to Radical Diversity, the new discussion series with the author and essayist Max Czollek and journalist and political reporter Mohamed Amjahid. We are very excited about today's kickoff of the series. Thank you everybody for tuning in. My name is Bettina Wodianka and I'm program curator of the Goethe-Institut San Francisco. Together with my colleague Lena Kuhnt, program curator of the Goethe-Institut, Washington, DC, we are introducing today's conversation. Radical Diversity is presented by the Goethe-Institut in North America in collaboration with its pop-up branches, the Thomas Mann House and the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity. The event series is sponsored by the Heinrich Böll Stiftung North America. Thank you all for the wonderful collaboration. In the following weeks and months, Max Czollek and Mohamed Amjahid are examining the challenges faced by German and North American societies, as well as various visions for progress by discussing them with experts in the US, Canada, and Mexico. Until the end of the year, conversations in Houston, Seattle, Mexico City, Montreal, and Boston will follow today's event. The new year of 2021 will start with discussion rounds on radical diversity in New York City, San Francisco, and Washington, DC.
We are delighted to kick off the event today in Los Angeles. Today's edition of Radical Diversity is a collaboration between the Goethe-Institut Los Angeles and the Thomas Mann House. We want to thank our colleagues Lian Heinrich Seleme and Daniel Shaffi of Goethe-Institut Los Angeles, as well as Nicolas Blaumer and Benno Hertz of the Thomas Mann House. Of course, we want to encourage you all to ask questions. You can do so throughout the entire event with the Q&A button below. The question will be collected, and at the end of the event, we'll have a short Q&A session with Priscilla Layne, Max Czollek, and Mohamed Amjahid. So what is actually the connecting element of all these upcoming conversations? And this will be our two moderators, Mohamed Amjahid and Max Czollek, who will step into conversations with various local guest speakers from the different locations. So Mohamed Amjahid is working as a political reporter for a weekly newspaper with a focus on human rights, equality, and radical changes in Europe, the United States, and the Middle East. His book, Among Rights, What It Means to Be Privileged, is a report on the state of German society in which he reflects on everyday racism and privileges. Amjahid grew up in Germany, attended school in Morocco, and studied political science in both Berlin and Cairo. Max Czollek is also an essayist and completed his doctorate studies at the Center for Research on Anti-Semitism in Berlin. He co-initiated the Disintegration Congress on Contemporary Jewish Thinking, as well as the Radical Jewish Arts Days. He's a writer of the essay Disintegrate Yourself, a call against integration into an allegedly German dominant culture. Max, Mohamed, we are thrilled to have you on board for this event series. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Lena. Thanks, Bettina, for this introduction. I'm so happy that we can start finally. We would like to discuss with Priscilla Layne about radical diversity today. Before I introduce Priscilla, just very briefly, we are planning to share 3 stories individually, which are connected to our topic, radical diversity, and then discuss the term itself. So Priscilla Layne is an associate professor in the Department of Germanic and Slavic Languages and Literatures at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. She recently published her book titled White Rebels in Black German Appropriation of African American Culture. She is currently working on the topic Afro-German Afrofuturism, and I'm so thrilled that you are our first guest. A lot of Germans know you from your appearance in a talk show named Maischberger, That's a talk show in the German public television. And there are two or three facts that I would like to share and then ask you about your own perspective. First of all, the talk show was about Black Lives Matter. A couple of weeks ago, that was, I think in June. And the talk show itself was planning to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement in the US with an all-white panel. So a lot of people, especially Black activists on Twitter and other social media in Germany, were pressuring the show to invite a Black voice. So last minute they did, and it was a good choice. I just rewatched it today. But you felt the need to go on Twitter and write a long thread about your upcoming appearance there. So maybe you can share your thoughts and your experience with that talk show.
Sure, and I'm very happy to be here to talk with you, Mohamed and Max. Yeah, so I had never heard of this talk show. When I've been to Germany several times and stayed there for a year on end, but I don't watch German talk shows, definitely not political German talk shows. So I didn't know it's like the equivalent of Bill Maher or something here, which is a show I don't like to watch. So when someone from the show called me, like Tuesday evening, I think, so a friend of mine, Siru Dix, who is a Black woman who lives in Maryland and teaches German in high school, she had texted me and said, this German program wants to talk to you about, racism in America. Can I give them your number? I said, okay, sure. I thought, they just want to talk to me over the phone, get a statement or something. So I was a little bit taken aback when I finally talked to him and they said, oh, we want you to appear on TV, So that freaked me out because I'm an introvert. I write a lot academically, but I'm actually not on Twitter that much. I kind of keep a low profile. But I thought, okay, I assume they're looking to talk to an African American who speaks German, about this topic. I thought that's fine, and I've lived in Germany, I can talk about the issues that they might want to hear about. So I didn't know any of the controversy about the show, that they had planned on originally having an all-white panel or that they had gotten criticized for that. So then the next morning, the day of my appearance, I woke up and my Twitter is going off, my phone is blowing up. I'm like, what is this? As an introvert, I'm really annoyed that I'm having all of these notifications. And then I saw, some people saying to them, okay, great, you invited this Priscilla Layne, but why so late, and why isn't a Black German going to be on the panel? And I thought, yeah, that's a great, question, because personally, I know, 3 or 4 Black German academics who have taught in the US, have spent time here. They could just as well talk about this topic as me, and that just got me reflecting that the reason this show didn't invite them is because they didn't do their research. If they had really talked, asked around, they would have gotten like a list of possible names of people to invite. So at the time, I thought that maybe they had reached out to me because I had been a little bit in the public eye a year or so before, because I'd been at the American Academy for a semester, and a stay there comes with a lot of engagements and giving talks, which was completely fine. But I understood that it gives me a certain access to the media that other people don't necessarily have, because it's a special grant for American scholars, and the house was founded by someone from the government, so it's got all the weight and prestige, and the power that America has along with it. Eventually I realized that, they had contacted me only because my friend suggested me, but yeah, I was just very upset that they hadn't really done the work, that they hadn't asked more people locally in Germany who would be a good person to have. And the fact that it was so last minute was really frustrating. I mean, the idea of having an all-white panel talk about Black Lives Matter is just crazy, I can't even conceive of it. So yeah, I felt the need to make that statement on Twitter because, you know, within my work, I write a lot about Black German culture and history. I respect the different Black German communities a lot. You know, I have friends who are artists. You know, I rely on them to let me interview them and share their work with me. And I wanted to make it clear that I think, you know, it's important that they are in the media and speak for themselves and not, you know, I wanted this trend to end that, you know, German publications, I feel, have this tendency to look to the US when they want an expert on racism or someone who's experienced racism, as if they can't find that in Germany. So I just wanted to make a statement about that at the time.
Okay, great. Yeah, Mohamed, if you want to say something. No? Okay. Thank you so much, Priscilla, for sharing that story. I think we're gonna come back to that and now just collect a few perspectives on this let's say German American field of tension, because I think like there's all kinds of different tensions we can open, and one of the ideas of this stories is that we kind of tell the people who are watching this tonight also a bit of where we're coming from and how we perceive our respective frameworks, but also the way we meet other frameworks or we take stuff from those frameworks. So the story I was thinking about when I was trying to come up with something to talk about tonight was two events actually that happened in the last half year in something you could call, in German there's an expression to say Sommerloch, which is like the void that happens in summer in media, and so people start to fill it with all kinds of unnecessary crazy stuff in media. So we did have a very prolonged corona loch, which kind of has really opened up to all kinds of, I don't know, filling the void discussions, and two of them have circled around well, now the problem starts. It could be freedom of expression, it could be freedom of art, and it could be anti-Semitism. And the two events I want to talk about is one, the discussion around a very famous post-colonial intellectual, Achille Mbembe from Cameroon, who was supposed to be the key speaker at a very famous art event in a series of art events in Germany. He had written something not only on BDS but also some kind of difficult statements on Israel and on the singularity of Holocaust as compared to other things, and that really triggered a very intense debate that had been lingering in Germany for the last year or so, or maybe years, on if the left, especially a post-colonial left, has a problem with anti-Semitism. So that was one discussion that happened in April. The whole festival got cancelled because of Corona, but also probably Achille Mbembe wouldn't have been able to talk. And so people started discussing also the question of whether it's okay to attack someone from Cameroon who's talking about post-colonialism and the way Germany has colonized certain parts of Africa, and to kind of make him shut up instead of listening to him. So that was the one side, and if it would have only been this side, it would have been interesting enough. But then something happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it circled around someone who was a comedian from Vienna. Her name is Lisa Eckert. I will only say this name once because she has gotten a lot of airtime now, but she's non-migrant, she's white, and she's telling this story, and she's doing comedy about minorities. Basically, she's making fun of minorities, classical stuff, something that at least in Germany is very standard repertoire in German comedy. And she was also making this very difficult jokes about Jews, which a lot of people perceived as anti-Semitic. So we had a similar discussion about whether something was anti-Semitic or not. And Lisa Eckert then got kicked out of one event where she was invited because, and now again, it's a part of the discussion, either she was, the people who were trying to do the show were threatened, but then later it turned out nobody threatened them. So in a way, what happened was they kind of created this idea of a left-wing threat, which never really happened, basically. But people were very ready to believe that because in Germany, there's this tendency, at least on the conservative side, to say the left is as bad as the right. So if the right is bad and it's getting worse because it starts to kill more and more people, then the left has to get worse as well, which is obviously not how politics work, but this is at least how people think about it. It's a bit of an arithmetic kind of equality. They believe the left and the right should be in, and then obviously in the middle, there's the good bourgeois center, bürgerlich, which kind of perceives itself as innocent and devoid of any left or right wing sentiment. So now what happened if you take Lisa Eckert and Mbembe, the two people that had been attacked for anti-Semitism, and I think both cases we should have discussed. If you look at what happened is Ashim Mbembe wasn't allowed to talk, and he was basically being cut out of the discussion, when at the same time Lisa Eckert became something like a hero figure of advocates of freedom of speech. And this I find very interesting, because suddenly you see that something that has started as a justified critique of anti-Semitism suddenly starts to affect people in a different way. And it starts to affect the same people in the same way unequally that before power has affected anyway. So what you do find is that discussion about discrimination becomes a repetition of the way exclusion usually works, and suddenly the field of discrimination critique becomes a reproduction of usual power structures. So that really made me think. That is really something that makes me think, and it makes me think beyond the question of whether X or Y is anti-Semitic. Obviously, that is important, but I would like to set this to one side and just think about how like unjust and unequal this treatment works. And then one last thought on that. One term that has really emerged in Germany in the last weeks, and I haven't really heard this before, and Mohamed, you can say if you perceive that differently, is the term cancel culture, which really has become something like a right buzzword in Germany now to describe a left critique of discrimination and the left treatment of how people are being treated that do discriminate. And it's a point of debate whether this even exists, whether there is an effective cancel culture. But then again, you would have to ask who is getting canceled by whom. Because if Ashim Mbembe is being canceled, it's because we have to protect the Jews. But if Lisa Eckert is being criticized for anti-Semitism, it's cancel culture by the left. This is the unequalness which I'm interested in, and which I thought may be interesting also to hear, also an American perspective on the term cancel culture, on the way debates are being led in the States, and maybe also point out differences and similarities, and maybe also changes a term like cancel culture has experienced by being transferred from the States to Germany. That's my story.
Yeah, no, thank you. I did hear about the case with Mbembe. I didn't read what he said about BDS or Israel, so I can't speak to his statements, but I did hear the controversy of him, being disinvited. The examples you gave me made me think of the ways in which anti-Semitism in the US, I would say, is mobilized by the right wing or by the Republican Party, even for their own purposes. So I feel like the accusation of anti-Semitism will get thrown around on the right, like for their own goals, not because they care about it, not because they want to stop it, but because it's useful to them. And I think the example you gave, we can also see in the US. So there are definitely anti-Semitic things that Trump has said, the ways in which Bernie Sanders has been critiqued, or certain symbols used to critique Hillary Clinton could also definitely be considered anti-Semitic. The way in which he I think at one point he told American Jews, like, if they don't vote for him, they're not really Jewish or something, just like outrageous stuff. At the same time, if anyone in the US criticizes Israel, he'll say they're anti-Semitic, right? So in the US, it's turned into this thing where the Republicans and the right, like, are, you know, diehard, you know, supporters of Israel, you know, won't criticize Israel at all. And if you do, then you're anti-Semitic, but they're allowed to say as many anti-Semitic things as they want. It's very confusing, I think, for a lot of people. And so, yeah, my motto has always been asking who's making the accusation, for whom, like in whose name, what is the end goal? And just being really skeptical at the way that these things are mobilized. I caught a little bit of the Republican National Convention recently, and I've noticed how they are taking up words from the left and just changing their meaning. They will use structural racism, you know, but they'll like morph it. It's really odd. But I've seen the same thing in Germany. So when I lived in Germany in the early 2000s, I saw the neo-Nazis marching with Rosa Luxemburg quotes, you know, wearing clothes that look like Antifa, right? So I think for people, it can get really confusing what side everyone is actually on. And I agree with you that the fact that Bembe is just disinvited and this comedian is protected for free speech, it definitely shows a power imbalance that, you know, Bembe doesn't have the platform, doesn't have the privilege, which for me is crazy because he's such a famous scholar and respected philosopher, but I guess he doesn't have the people don't know him in the right circles, right? Enough that they would, you know, insist that he gets to speak as well. Cancel culture, oh, yeah, I feel like I may be too old for that whole debate. I mean, I'm not the best person for that, I think, because I tend to like ambiguity. I like to like gray spaces. You know, one example I always think of is, you know, so I grew up listening to punk, and like there are a lot of songs that I listened to when I was little, when I was younger, that could be considered sexist or like, you know, just like, I don't know, just outrageous, you know, not PC nowadays. There are artists that I love who've come out and said racist things, you know, that I was really shocked by, but I love their music, you know. So I personally can't get on board because I think everyone has to make the decision for themselves, you know, whether to put their money behind someone or whether to give them a platform or listen to them. But I do think that it's become this like specter, you know, that the right will complain about, just like political correctness, that, you know, oh, the left is just trying to cancel everything and no one has a say. I don't see it as big as a problem as people would think. I think, you know, it's largely happening on social media, you know, for those of us old folks who aren't on social media that much, we're not really affected by it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a very important point with cancel culture is that some people and some communities are canceled structurally. They don't need another person or another subject to cancel them. They are like not able to speak as white people, for example, or someone like Trump. And then while listening to your stories, and thank you for sharing, I was always asking myself, why? Why are we talking about anti-Semitism, not only when it comes to Mbembe or that non-funny comedian, but also in other circumstances, other frameworks? And why were you invited to talk at Maischberger talk show? So I was thinking to share just a little moment from the Black Lives Matter demonstration here in Berlin. There was this big demonstration that was also featured in some news shows and some newspapers, where you had like, I think, at least 10,000 people coming together, which is a huge number in Germany. And so I was there. I went to Alexanderplatz. Some people would claim that's the center of Berlin, but we can discuss this too. And there was this, I could only enter with my press card. They, like, the police closed the entrances to the square. And while I was trying to move as distance as possible because of Corona, I was asking myself, and I couldn't help to have this thought, where have you been when other stuff happened recently in Germany? Because we had a couple of weeks before a terrorist attack on people of color in shisha bars in Hanau in West Germany. We had an attack on a synagogue in Halle, and I was as a reporter there at the same day, and I didn't see that amount of folks and people and this big demonstration. And I was also just asking myself, am I too bitter to complain about people coming out to demonstrate for Black lives? Because this is a good thing, actually. And I was looking around and I was seeing some very young people talking about being old. I felt very, very old that moment because they were like 16, 17. And they were like people who usually would go to Fridays for Future demonstrations. And I had the feeling that they were present and that was a good thing, but they didn't know what they were doing, basically. When you would talk to them or see the signs, it didn't really make sense. So I had that thought, how something which happens thousands of kilometers or I don't know how many miles away would really mobilize more people in Germany than events and bad events and events which really kill also Black people and people of color in Germany would do. So I rewatched, and coming back to Priscilla, to your perspective, I rewatched this famous talk show with you. And one question was very clear from the presenter. I will read it very briefly in German. She said something like, Polizeigewalt gegen Schwarze ist in den USA ein besonderes Problem. So police brutality against Black people is a big problem in the US. So I had the feeling she was emphasizing that police brutality, that's something you have to deal with this in Chicago, New York, or Los Angeles, but not in Germany. So I was wondering how you, because you know the American and the German discourse very well, how you observe this.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that there's this tendency to say that racism and police brutality are a problem for the US and not in Germany. And I think that's part of the reason why you have thousands of people march for Black Lives Matter and not for what happened in Hanau, or the synagogue attack. I forgot what city that was in. Oh, okay. Halle, Hanau and Halle, right. I was gonna say that for me, when I see the German protest for Black Lives Matter, I was touched, that people cared to protest, but I also think there's something performative about it that would put it on the umbrella of a I guess constellation of events. Like for me, there's a long history of German like performative solidarity with America, right? So I think of like Kennedy speaking in Berlin. I was in Berlin when 9/11 happened, and I remember all of the flowers at the embassy. When Obama spoke in Berlin and there was a huge turnout. So I feel like there's this, since the relationship of the US and Germany after World War II, there's this investment in US politics and this desire to show that you know what's going on there and that you care about it. But so it's like the good and the bad. I think it's nice that Germany, has this relationship with the US and wants to show that they care. I think it's bad that the problem of racism tends to get then exported to the US and allows Germans to ignore what's actually going on in the present. And one thing I've been thinking more and more about, so I recently started reading Olivia Wenzel's novel, 2017 in Angst. And one thing that's been on I love it, it's great. But one thing that's been on my mind is the question of the spectacle of violence. So or the spectacle of racism. So what kind of racism gets attention and what doesn't, So thinking about Germany, after reunification, you had the attacks on asylum seekers, in Rostock. You had the arson attack on a Turkish family in West Germany. And there, you know, the public was out on the streets, you know, people, it was very visible. And then you had, you know, the Lichterketten, you know, the demonstrations against racism. But then you think of the problem of police brutality, usually what happens is a Black person dies alone in a cell, right? There's nobody videotaping, there's nobody watching, nobody sees what happened, and that doesn't get as much attention. Like Ori Jallo, who I know, you know, his family and friends and a lot of activists have been fighting, you know, for justice for him. So I also wonder if that's part of it, because I feel like a lot of what Wenzel describes in her novel are these incidents of kind of like, I think of Hannah Arendt's term of, you know, the banality of fascism. I think of like banal racism, you know, like the everyday stuff that goes uncommented on, you know, and people just kind of shrug their shoulders. Actually, it reminds me of Max, in your book, Desintegriert, like when you talk about the normality, like the kind of normal everyday racism that Germans don't seem to be bothered by.
Priscilla, thank you for that kind of Vorlage keyword. I don't know. Yes, I was just, when you were talking, I was thinking about a concept that I took from Michael Bodemann, a sociologist from Canada, who developed the idea of theater of memory for a German Jewish context, trying to kind of understand how a German self-construction as a positive new German self after 45 was using the Jews as a symbolic position to kind of prove the point that one has become different. And in Deintegrate Yourselves, I'm kind of taking this and extending this idea to the theater of integration, which really is made for everyone who's coming to Germany and who has to adopt. And if you don't adopt, you're a bad migrant. If you do adopt, you're a good migrant. And then you have certain roles being scripted to certain people. I think that'd be another way to explain why, and I also see that in my circle of friends, that after Hanau and Halle, you really have no one trying to talk about systemic racism or systemic anti-Semitism in our group of friends. But if Black Lives Matter happens, suddenly everybody's pushing the issue of systemic racism. And I'm like, yeah, that's an important, I mean, it's important, but still, why are you pushing it now? And I think there's something deeply connected to this theater of memory and theater of integration, that we have become used to think about German society as something where violence against others only happens from the right wing. And it's not part of something like a normality of a German present. Why? Because the German present is a present where you can be proud to be German again, and where Germany has successfully worked through its past. A narrative that has been repeated also by a lot of American scholars who have said, look, amazing, Germany has done such a great job, we should have done the same, which maybe seen from an American perspective may still be something that would be felt like a success, but it produces some excess. And the excess it produces is that suddenly you reinvent yourself as a good German, and the good German is so powerful as an idea and an image that it forbids you to understand the systemic presence of historical oppression and police violence and anti-Semitism, racism in everyday society. And then obviously what you're going to do is, because it's still there, you're going to go out for Black Lives Matter, and you're not going to go out in the same way talking about right-wing terror and what it has to do with us. So there may be some performative quality that is not only the German-American relationship, but also performing a German new self that is proud to be German and not racist and not anti-Semitic, and that is without any danger to kind of shake this narrative, really, because if you talk about Black Lives Matter, there's no danger to shake the German perception of reality.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's interesting, this concept of the new German self, and to what extent that new self is always supportive of US struggles, right? Like the 68ers being interested in Black Panthers, et cetera. Actually, what you were saying about the ways in which Germans have utilized Jews and also Black Germans, you know, to present themselves as the good German. A Black German scholar, Fatima El-Tayeb, she has this book Undeutsch, where she says that's what's happened with the Syrian refugees who came recently, right? So she said, for a lot of Germans, it was easy to say, look how we're treating them. We let these refugees into the country, we're treating them well, we are good, right? And that group functions to help them perform that. But we don't care what happens to the Black Germans or the Turkish Germans or, anybody else. I think another problem that you've pointed out is that in order to be used by the majority in that way, you have to fit a certain mold. I think you also talk about this in your book, in the sense of German Jews. So you have to fit a certain mold. You have to be the good, the good migrant or whatever. And that's partly what my book, White Rebels in Black, is about, is that when you have this essentialized view of a group of people, you don't have room in your head for the diversity within that group, that there's diversity among German Jews, among Black Germans, among Turkish Germans, right? Because they just become a symbol for something against which around which you're able to create your identity. Oh, what I also wanted to say about Black Lives Matter, I was thinking about, how Black Lives Matter, feeds off of, the social media age. So I definitely support Black Lives Matter, and I think it's great that, the BLM, hashtag BLM, it's something very recognizable. I think it helps young people get on board really quickly, right? Especially with all the support from, say, stars, right? We have basketball players, well-known athletes, stars, wearing the t-shirts, right? It's very marketable in a way, I guess, that it's ironic because they're critical of capitalism and, the oppressive nature of capitalism, but there are people, making money right off of this slogan and selling the shirts and stuff. And I think, unfortunately, that also helps people get behind it more quickly. It's like, unfortunately, for Hano or Hala, you would need a slogan, right? You would need some catchy term that people can get behind, and then they become interested in it.
Which is part of another very banal mechanism that I observed also working as a journalist. I call it like the copy paste from the US discourse to the German discourse, cancel culture. You discuss this, like, for example, now in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you will find this discussion in the German feuilleton in the newspapers, because not all Germans, they can read English, but some of them, they do read then the New York Times, and then they copy paste this exact discussions, which is also becoming boring, because if you watch, for example, a late night show and you see that discussion, which is important sometimes in the US, and you read 2 weeks after something about like 3 pages about cancel culture, at least I ask myself, what are we talking about? I mean, are we talking about you as an author reading one text in the Washington Post and maybe watching an episode of Last Week Tonight or whatever? So that's the first thing. The second thing, which I think is very interesting, that this thought or notion of we are good Germans and we took the refugees also is extended into this group of refugees. I just talked to a Syrian scholar who lives since 5 years in Germany, and he basically told me, yes, I am a guest here, and I really think you do a good job by calling out racism, but I cannot do that because they were so nice to me and they were telling me this all the time. And I am, my mom taught me that I shouldn't talk back to the person I really also, I mean, I have to be thankful to be in Germany, basically. And so you have, and another friend, she is like Egyptian, and that's maybe an insider joke because Egyptians are known for being like very harsh people sometimes. She told me, like, Angela Merkel and Germany, they are like very, very lucky to have so many Syrians because they're like so nice people compared to the Egyptians. That's maybe another discussion, but like you have so many people who are in a vulnerable position and willing to adapt to that discourse. And this is something that I really think is problematic, because then you cannot see the diversity in that group.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's a problem when you're not willing to accept the full humanity of a person. Like, oh, they have to be eternally grateful, because they got asylum to stay in the country. It makes me think of Ai Weiwei, who ended up leaving Germany because he said, it's too racist. I'm going to England, you know. So I was thinking, actually, there's some parallels, I would say, to the U.S. So from my experience, so, there are not a lot of, African American people in academia, professors. And often when I'm in these spaces, I find that if you're Black faculty, Latinx, Asian American faculty, if you complain, then the reaction is kind of like, wait a second, we let you into this club, right? Like, you have the privilege to be at the university, you don't get to complain anymore, right? So I feel like there's this desire, that you're just going to assimilate into the system that's bad, into the broken system, and not criticize it, and just like be grateful that, the police are not shooting you or something, right? And I think that's crazy. I think that, if you truly, are anti-racist, don't judge people based on their appearance, then you'll accept the full complexity of them, because the fact is that there is no perfect immigrant, this kind of trope of the good immigrant reminds me of that the film that I watched a couple years ago, the Coleman Biden Hartmanns, which I don't know, I think it's called Welcome to Germany, which I hated. In part
I hate it. I hate it. I hate it.
Because the main character, right, is this Nigerian refugee, asylum seeker, and he's so nice. Like, people mistreat him, they almost get him arrested, all these awful things happen, and he's so nice to the benevolent German family for taking him in. And for me, it's a really insulting, dehumanizing role, because the fact is that, no migrant, no refugee is going to be this like always happy, super nice person. Like, we have a range of emotions. If you have to deal with discrimination, regardless of what context, you have a right to be upset about it. You have a right to, fight for equal treatment.
So maybe it makes sense to kind of explain one term that I'm gonna use now, which is the term of integration. Just to give an idea, like for the wider audience, I'm sure Priscilla, you know it, but like you have to have the 111 people participating right now. Hello, could you hear? Like, we don't really know what you know and what you don't. So and we're just talking and trying to give as much background as we think is necessary. If you got questions, please write them down. They're going to be sorted for us, and then we're going to choose them. We're going to talk about them in about 20 minutes, just for you to know. I just wanted to pick up on something that Priscilla just said now, which is the humanness of people who are being othered, if you want. So, just to give a bit of a background how this works in Germany, I just wanted to briefly introduce the notion of integration, which is the central idea and demand in Germany that is being put on people who migrate to Germany. And it's not only being put on people who migrate to Germany, but it's also being put on second and third generation people who have migrated to Germany and not migrated from everywhere. We're not talking about Denmark, Norway, or the UK, but we're talking about basically everything south of Germany, or everything south of the European borders of Europe. So this is the people who are supposed to integrate. And this is the people who are constantly being put under suspicion of not being loyal to the country. And we've seen that. We've seen that with Mesut Özil in the German World Championship. The German world team dismally failed last World Championship and just dropped out in the Vorrunde, in the 4 rounds, which for German measures almost felt like losing a war. And then they were wondering about who was guilty that they lost the war, and I think they couldn't find a Jew in the team, so they kind of looked for the migrant, and they found the migrant, and they said, look, Mesut Özil, this guy is the one, and you know what? Those two are the ones who are lacking loyalty to Germany, and because they're lacking loyalty to Germany, they're not shooting the goals they're supposed to shoot. which is an insane idea in professional sports, that you think you got to be loyal to your country in order to shoot goals. But besides that, it's very telling. And I think if you look at how this idea of one group deciding who's belonging and who isn't, and who has to adopt and who isn't, how this is kind of shaping the dehumanization, or I think Mohamed, was it Mohamed or Priscilla, called it like this symbolic function of the outside, of the other, how this is kind of taken away the idea of the humanness, because you cannot see the complexity of the person you're trying to put and to frame in a certain way. And this is, I think, one of the reasons, and I needed this loop to kind of to arrive at that point of counter strategy I wanted to talk about, of the point of deintegration, where I think one of the central motions or central ideas was to say, look, what happens if we're not going to play this game anymore? What happens if the people who are here in the second or third generation, people who have by all means been educated, been socialized, become part of Germany and are shaping Germany today? And what happens if they don't play along with this game of integration anymore, but say, look, like, you can go wherever you want to, but the position where we are right now is the position that defines this country. And if this is true, and if we all get together to define this new place, the whole notion of integration, of us having to move, is going to change, because we don't have to move anywhere anymore. And that, I think, that was something that kind of also played with the idea of the good Jew and the good migrant, to say, no, we're not good, we're angry. And anger is not part of the plan. The anger is not part of the plan for the Jew after 45, because the Jew after 45 has to be forgiving and thankful and sad and maybe scared. And everybody can understand that because of all the stuff they have been through. But if Jews after 45 are angry, or if they misbehave, then people get angry. And I think that led one psychiatrist once, like a few years back, to say, Auschwitz war keine Besserungsanstalt. Auschwitz was not a place of betterment. You didn't become, pain doesn't make you better. It just doesn't. And I think there's a certain degree of like maybe theater or art being the place where right now in Germany, this kind of abyss, or this kind of difficult side, also difficult for yourself, because you got to kind of reflect upon your own, I don't know, problems and things that have been engraved into you without you deciding, how this has become a place where we can talk about that. Because for no one, especially if you experience discrimination, then on top of that, you also have to reflect upon discrimination that doesn't make you better, which is very painful, I think. Especially like if I look at my family, it's very painful to understand that the whole things we have been through haven't really been for anything. Like, it really hasn't made anything good out of it. And that is really something that I think there's a discussion going on right now in Germany, just trying to talk about that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. It resonates with what's going on in the US right now. So, just a few days ago, an African-American man was shot in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Jacob Blake, shot 7 times by police in front of his children. They said he was just trying to break up a fight, right? So now there's been protests, there's been damage, fires. And then, so to hear people on the right say, this is not acceptable. It's like, you don't get to decide how we respond to systemic racism and violence. I've seen this quote going around on Facebook, we will not protest our genocide quietly. That's basically, saying the stakes are much greater, like I said, are much bigger than property damage. Like, who cares about that? This is about people saying they have a right to exist. When you were talking about integration, it was making me think that when the Germans say this is what it takes to be integrated, it's as if Germany were this monolith, like as if all Germans were the same, right? So just like you have Germans who eat pork and Germans who don't eat pork, right? So how do we decide then who is not German, right? I feel like the word integrated is then gets thrown around. Like it's, you know, it's like this pass that you get if you're being good, but then when you misstep, they take it back. Like that's what they did with Özil, right? Oh, you're going to be, you know, in America it would be uppity. You're going to be uppity. We are taking back this privilege of acknowledging you as one of us. So I definitely think that in both the U.S. and Germany, there's this problem of that. Actually, it made me think. Teaching German studies, I often have to read books that are terrible, you know, just for my research. And one of those was Salazin's book, Deutschland schafft sich ab, right? So I read that because I often teach Turkish German culture and history, and I wanted to know what his argument was. And I remember this comparison he made. You know, he said, you know, if you look at the 60s, you know, the people who came as guest workers, you know, the Greeks, the Italians, they're so well integrated. But the Turkish Germans, you know, they're not integrated at all. And I thought, okay, what about whiteness? You know, he doesn't. So if you're Greek and Italian and you're Christian or Catholic and coming into a nation that is Christian and Catholic, I'm sure you're going to have less barriers, right? But if you're Turkish German, if you're racialized based on how you look, based on your religion, if you wear a headscarf, you know, if you're visibly different, clearly you're going to have more trouble, you know, with this majority society that thinks that that is not a part of their culture. So it just really annoys me, you know, how this discussion of integration gets, how integration is discussed without talking about whiteness, without talking about race, because that's definitely part of it. It's not just about, you know, differences in religion and, you know, tradition versus modernity or whatever.
Yeah, I would like to take your thoughts and connect them to two words, radical and diversity. Some people would argue what Priscilla said, for example, about you don't decide how we react to systemic racism. That's for some people here in Germany, at least, that's a very radical thing to say. I remember that a couple of weeks ago, we had riots in Stuttgart where some young people, some of them were brown folks, some of them were Germans, but the visible ones, they were like the Mohammeds there. They broke like some shops and a Rossmann, I think, a supermarket. So a lot of people, they were like, now they are breaking our Rossmann. Oh my God, tomorrow they will take over, I don't know. And coming in and saying, okay, that was like a non-political framework, by the way, but let's talk about responses and let's talk about what is actually possible and what's not actually possible. A lot of people would say, you going on the street for protesting against racism is a very radical thing to do in these times of pandemic, for example. So it's also always which resources you have to respond. If no one is listening to you for decades and decades, I can understand and relate that some people are very, very mad and going to try to make their voices heard in a way or in another. The other word or term is like diversity, and this maybe connects to what Max said earlier about integration, because diversity could be like an ad or a flyer where you have like all the skin colors, or sometimes from a queer perspective, like a nice rainbow, and a company or a media outlet or a government can say, look how diverse we are. And I found myself a couple of times in this situation, someone asking me to put my face actually on a flyer. So from my point of view, that's not the diversity we are trying to promote, at least, or talk about. So maybe before we take the questions in 7-8 minutes, we can talk more about radical diversity, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I've been thinking about, you know, what radical diversity could mean to me. I think I have two separate threads. So on the one hand, this idea of, you know, just different groups living together in a society, acknowledging their differences, being like embracing them, you know, not so definitely not assimilation, Integration, I struggle with what that means exactly, you know, but I just think of this idea of a group of people who are living in a society and want to make it better, you know. But also with radical diversity, I also think about the diversity of individuals. So, you know, this idea that Black people are not a monolith, you know, queer people aren't, Turkish German, German Jewish, you know, there's diversity within each group. When I think of just, you know, the intersections of myself, it's like I'm, you know, African American, but I'm of Caribbean descent, you know, I'm a mother, I have anxiety, you know, there are all these different parts of me that, you know, are either more pronounced or less pronounced depending on the context or who I'm engaging with. And it's frustrating to kind of be just thrown into a group, and people can just assume they know what I think, you know, just based on the fact that I'm Black. Oh, and the final thing I would say is radical diversity to me would also be like about being excited about diversity, excited about the increasingly different ways in which subjects are, people are. Like I think of, you know, I've encountered people in teaching who, you know, nowadays we ask students what their preferred pronoun is. You know, what is their gender, what is their preferred pronoun? And I've had some teachers push back, you know, like, oh, now I have to learn these new words. And I'm like, who cares? Just learn more words, you know, let's just keep having more genders. Like, why do we have to stick to one system? Why do we have to have one way because that's how we've always done it? Just let people, you know, identify the way they would like to be, and, you know, the society can keep getting more different and colorful, and I think that's a good thing.
Yes, thank you, Priscilla, for your thoughts. I'm just gonna add to them. I think radical diversity, the way we've put it as the headline for this series, is also meant as an invitation to think about whether this fits any things of what we're working on anyway, or something we're thinking about anyway. Maybe we're even using it already. I can say that I'm part of the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity. So we have kind of been working with this term a lot, and for the next discussion in Houston, we're going to have someone from the team of the Institute give a talk on some of the conceptual backgrounds of what we're actually thinking about. Just to put that in the framework of what we have been talking about now, I would highlight the actual meaning of the word radical, because radical really means to go to the root of things, and it can mean to shake the root, but it can also mean to put diversity at the root. And I think, especially in Germany, what we experience is that we are operating on we are operating on a system that is not made and not fit for the diversity of society, of a pluralistic democracy. We are operating on a system that is still putting diversity as the most crucial problem instead of the root of how society works. So suddenly you have integration and hegemonic culture and Heimat and all those concepts that are being proposed now, and they just don't fit. They're not fit for, I don't know if they've ever fit, but now they don't. And I think if I'm talking about radical diversity, I'm trying to highlight that we have to invent and reimagine concepts that actually leave space on a political level for this kind of diversity, because we have to acknowledge that the idea of a militant, of a wehrhafte Demokratie, of a democracy that can defend itself, must be based in appreciation of difference. Because the appreciation of likeness is something that the right wing is much stronger in doing than a pluralistic society will ever be. So we have to kind of really take the strength out of diversity, and this is what I perceive as an idea of radical diversity. And this is, considering the current situation in Germany of the political concepts we're using, also radical in a sense how Mohamed said it, as something that really is shaking up the core not only of a right wing but of a very established idea that is being shared all through the social democrat, like social democrats are using that, the Greens are using that, and also the CDU is using that, and the left wing. So you find those concepts everywhere. So really what we have to do is go to the roots of the imagination of how society works within politics. And really, we got a very long way to go right there.
Actually, what you're saying about this this idea, you know, of this sameness, I was thinking like, and how much is that tied into the nationalist project, right? The 19th century idea of what Germany is, because right, before you had, you know, a Danish minority, you had Slavic minorities, you know, living within what is now Germany. I remember when I was recently in Germany, there was this debate in the Bundestag, I think, about what language the people should speak, and someone said like it has to be Hochdeutsch. I forgot what the issue was, and then someone who spoke Plattdeutsch was like, no, like held a speech in Plattdeutsch. So there's already diversity within Germany, right? And that's something that the right-wing people they try to smooth over, right? This idea of homogeneity is a myth, right? And I think, yeah, the pluralism is the reality, and I definitely like this idea of putting the diversity at the root and just changing the concept of what the country is.
Which is also maybe interesting to look at is how German immigrants in the US behaved when they arrived. That's maybe a topic for itself. But I was in New York in a museum, and I just thought that's a parallel society, Parallelgesellschaft. What happened in New York? Germans really forming their own communities and trying basically to advocate for their own interests and rights and lobby, which is totally fine in the US, basically looking at the Federalist Papers. If you agree, I would take some questions. Is that fine? Okay, there is a very, very easy question. Zubi Mohammed is asking, will the recording be made available? And I can say yes, and we will all share it as soon as possible. It will take some days, but I think Thomas Mannhaus, Goethe, Max, and I will share the link then. And then Kirby Washington asked, I read the question. It seems like the same mechanisms to create and maintain structural and institutional racism are the same in both countries. Could the techniques to dismantle these systems also be the same? And can we have some international coordination on the dismantling? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've thought about this in terms of education. I think within the US, we've luckily made more progress in terms of diversifying, you know, people in higher education, the kind of professors that you get. And part of that comes from, it was a very deliberate effort. You know, we have this word that we use called pipeline, to build a pipeline to train students to then teach at the different levels. And I'm a product of that. I got a scholarship when I was a sophomore in college to help me get into grad school. I benefited from the financial support, mentorship while I was in grad school. And now this program that I'm a part of, it's called the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship. We're like hundreds of people of color who are now professors and can mentor then young students in turn. I think something like that would be great for Germany. A friend of mine who's a Black German graduate student at University of Bremen, he told me that they proposed something like this to the DFG, and they said, oh no, that would be positive racism. If we give people of color special treatment. And it's really frustrating because I think it's not special treatment. It's giving people of color access and opportunities that they have been excluded from, which has created a higher education system that is very white.
Yes, I do. Right. I think there's a certain level where we can exchange something like best practice, right? Like stuff that has worked, and then we'll have to see if it works. And I think that happens also. Like there's in education, also in Europe, you find a lot of exchange for that because obviously some systems work better than others, and the German system is not necessarily the one working best. So there's a lot of stuff that has kind of been learned from that. Still, I'm wondering if we're talking about something like the fight against discrimination, whether finding the same mechanisms also means that we already can use the same means to dismantle them. I feel that, for example, history and the specific makeup of society and the specific history of certain concepts of belonging are extremely central for a precise intervention in those societies. So something that is going to work in the US is not necessarily going to work in Germany. It may, but my math teachers in school always said, if you find a solution that is very complicated for a simple problem that could be solved differently, she always said it's like this. So what you find is maybe you find something like a mechanism, an intervention that works, but it may not be the best intervention to use. So, and I think there's something that we won't probably get around talking about today, but if you're talking about the German context, I do wonder, and I think we'll have to talk about whether categories like POC are actually the only categories we need to talk about the different migrant groups we find in Germany today. Because in Germany, for example, you have a group of people who calls themselves Kanaks, like a Kanakische culture, which have played a very important role in the workers' movement, especially the migrant workers' movement in Germany, because they came as so-called guest workers in the 60s to rebuild Germany, basically, and then they were kind of spit out of Germany after reunification because Germany said, so now we got the East Germans, we don't need you anymore. So you have that on the one hand, then you have Afro-Germans on the other hand, something that Priscilla has worked on. So you have a very different setup of society, and also the history of völkische thought in Germany is different from the history of like systemic racism in the States. There are similarities, but also there are a lot of differences. So I do come to believe in the last months, thinking also about this series, that the reason why we need to talk is that I think what we do share is a certain ethical interest in criticizing discrimination and in trying to make something like radical diversity a reality. But we need to talk because we have to exchange the very specific differences and like the specificities of the places we're based at. And they may not even be restricted to the States or Germany, but also to Houston or LA or Washington. So I think this is what may emerge in the next rounds, in which I want you to invite to kind of come and join us again, is when we continue talking, that maybe also we're going to find kind of differences also between the different cities in the US, but also when we come to talk in Canada and talk for a talk in Mexico, obviously there's going to be differences in North America as well. So I guess we need both. We need this ethical kind of agreement on the critique of discrimination and this openness to accept new forms of discrimination, which may put us in the position of the privileged. But at the same time, I think we got to keep an ear, like an open ear, to the specificities of the situations, because if we don't kind of listen to them, we feel like we've understood when maybe we've not really gotten the point yet, and then we do this, and this may not be the best kind of solution we'll find.
This is, by the way, a Moroccan thing. My mom says, like, when I look for something and it's right next to me, she says, oh, you're looking for your ear. But there are two other questions I would like to share my thoughts. Maybe you can then also jump in. There is Magda Tarnowska-Senel. She's asking about Mesut Özil because we mentioned him. He was accused of betraying Germany's values because he took a picture with Erdogan. What are your thoughts about it? First of all, it's very, very stupid to take a picture with a dictator. Like, we can agree on that. But the point is, as Max explained, is that there again was this role of the other person, like really being blamed that Germany as a whole, in this case, maybe the German team stands for the nation, had to face a very difficult time. So how dare you really breathe and exist the way you did? So we lost the tournament. And there, I think it's important to look at different standards which are applied on white people on the one hand, and Black people and people of color on the other hand. A couple of weeks ago, the keeper of the German team, Manuel Neuer, was in vacation in Croatia, and he was caught on video singing basically Nazi song, like a right-wing Nazi song. And I wrote an Instagram post about that, criticizing that compared to Özil, Manuel Neuer, who is like a white German man, was not blamed that German soccer really is at the end, or Germany will, or we lost the war again, as Max would paraphrase it. So here you can see like two different standards being applied on people who made mistakes. That's the first thing. Maybe you can add something in a second. There's another interesting, not question, but just an interesting description from Barbara Wood, who lives in the Netherlands. And she says that she read the book of Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Infidel, and she found that the failed integration of Muslim immigrants into that society was confirmed through that reading, and that diversity needs a base, and the question is what values you choose to live together. So first of all, I would say, of course, this is an essentialist way to describe things, to say failed integration of Muslim immigrants. That's what we basically were talking about here, while Max also was explaining what integration means. I'm not like an expert in Dutch affairs. Some people think the Netherlands and Germany are the same thing. But it's very important to stress out again what Priscilla was saying, that there is a certain diversity within a group. There is nothing like Muslim immigrants. What does that mean, basically? That's the first thing. The second thing, Rotterdam is governed by a Muslim mayor, so I guess Barbara Wood cannot go to Rotterdam anymore because all Muslim immigrants are not well integrated. And the third thing here is what values are important so we can live together. And I would argue, also in the sense of de-integration, I would argue I don't want to live or integrate myself in values such as voting for a right-wing party, which is anti-Semitic and racist. That's for me not a value worth to integrate in, you know? So it's also very important to open up the discussion about this value thing. I don't know in the US if it comes often, but in Germany, we always have this discussion of, yeah, you need to stick to our values. And I'm always like asking, what are your values, and are we counting the values from 33 to 45 also in this discussion? So maybe you have any thoughts on that.
No, I completely agree with you. I think, yeah, to refer to Muslim immigrants is kind of ridiculous because, like you said, it's a huge group. Who are we talking about exactly? Muslim people have been living in the Netherlands now for, decades. It's clearly they're successfully living there in parts of communities. And I also don't know much about the Netherlands, but I think there's this whole, there's the myth of tolerance, right? Like Dutch tolerance, which this historian Rita Chin writes about in her book on multiculturalism. And to what extent the myth of Dutch tolerance has to do with a not wanting to talk about the colonial past, right? Which is something Netherlands might have in common with Germany. Let's see what, I can't remember what you asked me. Oh, the values question. Yeah, I think we do sometimes have that discussion in the US. What those values are, I'm not sure. Something vague like freedom or like love of freedom or like consumerism, I don't think our values are, are that great or sophisticated necessarily, but I think in the US it's the same thing, that, you know, there's some immigrants who are useful for being utilized, you know, by the majority, and some who are not. Those who resist that get marked as the bad immigrant, you know.
The head of the ICE police force is now an Asian American man who I just read it today, who just emphasizes that he came legally to the country and had a legal path to the citizenship, which is also a nice way to describe, you know, tokens and how values can really be instrumentalized to just push your own agenda or something. So it's, I mean, you also, what I want to say, you also have bad people of color sometimes.
Right. Yeah. No, I was thinking about that. I forgot in what context that, you know, just because you have a, you know, an African American person or Asian American or Latinx person heading a horrible organization, that doesn't change the fact that the structure is awful, right? So, I think, yeah, when we were talking about diversity and the ways in which you mentioned like corporate diversity and the ways in which it can become just like an ad campaign where you show the rainbow of different, you know, ethnicities you have. I think that's definitely a very superficial way that diversity gets used, as, okay, let's put a person of color in charge of this big, awful organization, and now everything is better. I think that people who support Black Lives Matter, and I would say concepts like radical diversity, would say that's not acceptable. You know, that it's also about fundamentally changing the structure, changing, you know, white supremacist structures that exist in the US and in Germany.
Yeah, Priscilla, thank you. I'm very thankful for that. As I'm thankful for this whole discussion, I like that the intensity it has also gained in this discussion with the audience. Now it has become more funny, I feel, and which I'm really thankful for, because really, like, being polemic or being funny is also a way to kind of respond to certain projections. And it's a means to survive. But Priscilla, what you're saying is totally correct. I also see that, and speaking, I think for the whole Institute of Social Justice and Radical Diversity there, that obviously also one reason we put the radical in diversity is that when they started the Institute 20 years back, diversity really wasn't a term that was kind of around very much. But then it became this buzzword that by now is being used by German institutions, by German enterprises and all those things, and it has become something like an argument of economic gain, to say, look, you got to get a diversity in your team, because then you're going to reach different target groups, then you're going to be more sensible to the next shitstorm, and then you're going to be more productive, really. And that is not what we're aiming at. We're aiming at maybe Martha Nussbaum's ideas of Gerechtigkeit, of justice, which is going to be Anerkennungsgerechtigkeit, it's going to be justice of recognition, justice of distribution, distributional justice, I think she calls it, and everything you're going to hear about next time with the Houston event, because now I think it's going to take too much time. But yes, there's a very specific critical concept lurking behind this idea of radical diversity. Maybe just to add one thing to something that you've been talking about, Mohamed and Priscilla, which is the question of the Muslims. I just would like to, for my new book, I was kind of going back and reading something that a German rapper who's also a doctor. Her name is Lady Bitch Ray. Now she's Dr. Bitch Ray. She's a famous, like a legend in rap, and also in feminism, and also in activism, and now also in research. And she pointed out to me once more, she reminded me that back in the 90s, the people who were being othered weren't called Muslims. There was no such thing as Muslims in Germany. And it's very important to remember that, because society tends to forget so quickly. This is like 30 years back, there were no Muslims. There was Ausländer, foreigners, and there was Turks and Arabs, and that was basically it. Right, so every group had a different label, and that was usually a national label. And suddenly, and obviously that was 2001, September 11 on the one hand, but also the book of Sarrazin you mentioned. What happens is that slowly the discussion changes, it shifts. And it shifts to a point when now my friends are being made Muslims by their names, even though they have no connection to to Islam. They may be Christian. They may be have a different religion altogether. But it's more like the national ascription is still behind that idea of Muslimism, but it's just being kind of blurred by the way to just call everyone Muslim. And that really is making this category extremely difficult, even to say a sentence like, the Muslims are not X. I'd really want to ask, what Muslims? Like, what are we talking about? And why are we talking about Muslims? Because if we're talking about young men in custody, we're talking about a specific problem that may have much more to do with young men in custody than with being Muslim. So and I'd say this is just plain good sociology to kind of wonder if there is a real causal relationship between the one thing and the other, or whether the category you're constructing isn't something that has much more of a societal kind of presence than it has as justification from a sociological point of view. So but that is just, I know now I've deconstructed the question, and probably there's still going to be a lot of things to talk about. I just wanted to point out that people have been made Muslims that weren't Muslims before, and that by itself is and that is curious. That really makes me curious that suddenly now you have a society that's being made up of Jews and Muslims and what? Christians. So what happens really is that Christianity becomes reinvented by kind of putting the Muslim on the other side. And I'm wondering where this is leading, actually.
I was saying, or Christianity becomes invisible because it's normative, right?
Sure.
So you don't notice the cross on the wall in the school. You don't notice that people celebrate Christmas in the school. But
true.
Right,
but the only thing I'm trying to say is that suddenly Christianity, which really has been on the demise in Germany for the last, I'm from East Germany, so here Christianity really doesn't play much of a role. Suddenly, by kind of formatting society in a way that it's been made up of religions, Christianity reemerges as a sign of Germanness. And then you see what we're talking about, the crosses in the Bavarian schools. That is exactly what comes
It's
out.
actually Christonormativity.
Yeah.
And I could tell a lot of stories about walking as a Mohammed into any white space and what effects, but we have only 10 minutes left. I would suggest that we take 2 more questions. Is that okay for you? Yeah. So one question, I can comment very briefly on it, and then I will take another question. So someone asks, how do the different political parties in Germany address race and or diversity? In the US, we have the 2 main parties, but in Germany, many more parties. It's of course a very historical difficult question with it comes with the story of the CDU, which is the biggest party in Germany, the Christian Democratic Party, that had to be convinced that Germany is an immigrant country for years, and they were discussing if we have immigrants or not. So there you can see that this was or is still a very difficult discussion. Many more parties does not mean political diversity, I think. We have some parties which are very flexible in the way they also talk about diversity. And then because we have this coalition system between parties, I would argue that at the end it comes to with whom I have to govern and what I can give and take. So usually issues that affect minorities, people of color, are not that important for a lot of parties. So I cannot say that there is more diversity compared to the two-party system in the US. Also, Kimberly Washington just stressing out that you in the US will have a lot of value discussions also tonight at the RNC. I thought that's like a very interesting thought again. Another question is from Enrique Giron or Giron. The influence of the American discussion on diversity is a good start. What actions at the individual level can help to start addressing local problems? Also, maybe I would add with the term radical diversity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, I was having some problems with my mouse. I think that might be a question that Max could answer more. I mean, I don't know a lot about what's going on politically locally. I spend most of my time in Berlin when I go to Germany, and there is, you know, Black Lives Matter there. There's Black German community centers that are always doing events, cultural events, education, teaching German, you know, to people. So I do think that, you know, there probably is already a lot going on locally.
I must admit, I'm not quite sure if I understand the question correctly, because it's kind of in my head. It's maybe you know, here it's 10:30 p.m. So maybe there's a knot in my head. I'm taking it all on me. But I'm just trying to, like, for one, there has been a vibrant exchange in Mohammed. Did you have a no? There has been a vibrant exchange among especially minorities in Germany and the States. I just want to point out to one that has been extremely important, which is the meeting of Audre Lorde and Maya Yim and other very important actors who kind of really jump-started Afro-German movement in Germany, and who have become extremely important also afterwards, not only for that, but also for discussions on critical whiteness, for discussions on also post-migrant ideas and critiques of the way things in work in theater and things work in public display. So I think you do find a lot of those as like inspirations that happen, and then they kind of become localized as they meet the German context. And you find another one with hip hop, for example. Hip hop meets the German situation in a moment when migrants are being threatened, and especially Turkish and Arab migrants being threatened by Nazis in Germany, being killed and chased through the streets. So you find the Kreuzberg 36er from Kreuzberg in Berlin, who kind of start do hip hop and at the same time organize in gangs to fight off Nazis. So what you find is that this culture that has been developed within a very different context of black oppression in the States, is being used by different groups who experience a different kind of oppression, but still understand that hip hop may be a tool for them to kind of work on that and develop counter strategies. And at the same time, you find hip hop also hitting in the south of Germany. People like Tolch and Toniel and linguists with their group Advanced Chemistry, which is also deeply political, but much more, let's say, academic in a way. So they're like they quote Heine, and they like, the one is from Haiti, the other is from Italy, the other one I think is from the US. You have like a different constellation there, and you have two beginnings of hip hop really, and they both take influences from the US. Kreuzberg 36, for example, the guy who taught the people in Kreuzberg, his name is Maxim, who sadly was stabbed by a pensioner in a few years back in the east of Berlin, which is an insane story by itself. And he learned hip hop from American soldiers in the south of Berlin because they were stationed there. And you can tell a lot of those stories. But again, I'm not sure if that is the question, because I think there was something else in it which I don't. Also, I'm trying to find the question now, but which I'm not quite sure if I got. So please excuse me if I didn't quite answer the question.
No, I think I don't know. There is something. No, I'm going to say it. There is something like an addressing racism industry right now. You know what I mean? It's like, as Priscilla said, there is this accessibility and this merchandising, and you can buy a book or buy a t-shirt and say, yes, Black Lives Matter, and then go happy back to your home and say, I did something about it. There is like this big discussion about the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, where I found it very, this is why I say in the US you are like 20 years ahead, because this book is recently, like, it just arrived in Germany. But in the US, I read a lot of articles stressing out that a lot of white people, they bought the book and they read it and they think they are like, it's good now. I mean, they read the book. So just because that was like how to address racism in a local context and like emphasize radical diversity, it's not, unfortunately, it's not that easy. And it's always like difficult to try to not feel in that trap of feel well attacking racism thing that we have right now.
Actually, that may remind me of something that was said earlier about the way that white Germans respond to the accusation, that racism exists in Germany. I was thinking about the ways in which white Americans, white Germans' feelings are so caught up in the word racism. So I haven't read White Fragility. I've heard the critiques about the book. And it made me think, I've been reading a lot of James Baldwin this summer, and I think he's a really great person to read when you're trying to grapple with this, because he talks a lot about like kind of the soul, white American soul, and like how, the guilt and how, what it feels like for them to be called racist. And so, they want to do anything but be labeled that. I think we have to do a lot with addressing the psychology and acknowledging privilege, because I've often been frustrated in Germany by, when I say, oh, the racism in Germany, they say, no, there's no racism, there's xenophobia. Like there's this fear of, if you acknowledge that it's there, that it will undo, as Max was saying, this whole new identity that they had built for themselves. And I often try to point out to people the difference between structural racism and you as an individual, discriminating against someone, right? That even if you're not discriminating against someone one-on-one or calling someone the N-word, you might still be profiting from structural racism and white supremacy and white privilege, right? I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. They want to be the good German or the good American, and not think about the complexities of the issue.
Well, yeah, thank you. I think you could say the same probably about Germany, and maybe that's a good point to stop at, to say that recognizing privilege, I think is something that I'm also wondering about, especially with the whole Corona situation, especially in Germany, which was very strict, but at the same time comparably successful if you look at the US. What you do find is that a lot of people that are discriminated against in Germany at the same time profit from a national shutdown that is again excluding other people who are collecting the vegetables in the field, or people who are dying in the camps at the border of the European Union. And suddenly you become complicit with the system that also discriminates you. So I do find myself wondering a lot about the complexity of discrimination and privilege, and how this may have to be fed into a more complex idea of intersectionality that is not only focusing on discrimination and multiple discriminations, but also on the way we have agency to act, because privilege always means agency to act. It doesn't only mean guilt, it also means we can do stuff. And I think if we don't conceptualize that, we may not be able to understand why we're actually capable of doing stuff. Right, so
Yeah.
that was maybe one last thought.
Yeah, no, I think bringing up agency is really important, because I think that was part of the critique with white fragility, that it's created this movement where, you know, let's say white women, you know, suburban women can have their book club and read White Fragility and feel better, like they've atoned, you know, for their racism, and then it stops there, right? But that doesn't help Black people. That doesn't help people of color. Like if you want to, you know, address problems like the school to prison pipeline, the prison industrial complex, you know, the fact that Black people and Latinx people are dying more from COVID, all of those things, those take interventions, whether it's voting, you know, local voting, national voting, you know, advocating. Those are, it's got to be more than just reading a book, and it's got to be more than just the performative, I'm going to go to this demonstration and take my selfie, you know, or I'm going to like wear a t-shirt. So I think, yes, definitely saying agency, actually doing things to make the change is very important.
All right, well, there's a lot of loose threads tangling right now, eine Menge lose Enden. But I think that's probably what a discussion like this is supposed to do, and maybe the only thing it can do, which is to leave you with more questions than you've come with. If you feel like this place is a good place to ask and find even more questions, just join us again on September 16. We're going to do another talk in Houston. That time it's not going to be with Mohamed, who's gonna do the next one after that. Where's it gonna be, Mohamed, after the 16th?
I think in Seattle.
In Seattle. So the next one, September 16th, is gonna be Houston. We already got the lineup, even though we don't have the time yet. And the lineup is gonna be, I hope I'm saying it correct, is Ashley de Hojos, who is a curator of like different artworks, is part of a collaborative interdisciplinary art space in Houston. She's going to talk about her curational practice and taking a more artistic perspective on questions of radical diversity. And Jeanette Joy Harris, who is also a writer, also curator, but also someone who has been working with within science and theory. And then, as I said before, we're going to have Corinne Kassner joining the group, giving a bit of a conceptual background on how radical diversity has been conceptualized within the Institute for Social Justice and Radical Diversity, who's one of the partners organizing this or being part of this discussion group. I think this is all I want to say. Please come and join us again. And thank you all for being, especially thank you Goethe-Institut and Thomas Mannhaus for making this possible. Also Heinrich Böll Foundation. And also thank you, Priscilla, especially for joining us for this first talk. It was extremely interesting for me. There's a lot of stuff I took with me, which I'm gonna try to look up and think it through in the next days and weeks. And thank you, Mohamed, for being part and for doing this with me. It's really a great pleasure to have both of you here.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you both, Mohamed, Max. Yeah, it's been really fun discussion.
But yeah, you have a great day, I must say. We'll have a
right,
great
yeah.
You all have a great day.
I'm going to sleep now. I'm going to bed. Thank you. Bye-bye.